Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another Ghost of Fear Street book review, and it's book number 33, Attack of the Vampire Worms. Now, I've had this book in my collection for some time, and I've been meaning to get around to it, but I've been savoring it for a good moment, and I was looking at my bookshelf the other day, and I was like, you know what, I'll finally read this, because my good friend Spongy444 told me that this was one of the best Ghost of Fear Street books that he ever read. I think he's read the whole series, or at least close to it. So I was like, all right, let's see if this book lives up to the hype. And I have to say, Spongy, you're right on the money with this one. This book was great. I was honestly blown away by the quality of this one. Easily, this is the best Ghost of Fear Street book I've read up to this point. Now, I've only read 3, but this one reminds me of a classic original 62 book that has a lot of fans and supporters out there. It's kind of like The Haunted School, but done in a brand new concept. And it's also reminiscent to what Are You Afraid of the Dark would put out in season 7 called The Tale of the Photo Finish. Now, Photo Finish and Haunted School are pretty much very similar, but this one is a bit different. And I have to say, this in terms of Ghost of Fear Street has to be one of the scarier books I've come across. It has some of the best villains I've come across in these. So that was refreshing to see. And yeah, if you have not read this book, do yourself a favor and pick this up, because you will be shocked by some of the direction choices that go here. And it's one of those books that you can clearly tell has some of the better kids' horror protagonists out there, and some of the more sympathizable and relatable characters as well. Even though, they don't go into too much depth with this one, it's still very serviceable and definitely commendable for that. Another thing to get across before we go any further, if you're not familiar with the Ghost of Fear Street line, Ghost of Fear Street was the kids' horror spinoff of the Fear Street books, which are a young adult series written by R.L. Stine and various ghostwriters. It depends on what volume you're looking at. And Ghost of Fear Street was 35 books, and they were all ghost written. This book in particular was written by Katherine Hapka, and I have to say her writing in this was very easy to digest for 116 pages. You can't get better than this for a ghostwriter. So, yeah, if you're worried about that, and if you might be out there with a ghostwriter stigma or something, you should probably put that aside and check this out, okay? So with that out the way, let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So the story starts off with the main character, Jane. She's a baseball player, and she is up to bat at this baseball game, and she ends up choking this play because of her friend Lewis. And her friend Lewis is her best friend in Shadyside, the town that pretty much all the Fear Street books take place in. And Lewis is kind of the polar opposite of her. She's more athletic and outdoorsy, while Lewis is more book driven. So he's always has his head in a book or something like that. And she's temporarily upset, but kind of like, blows it off because, Lewis is just a lovable kid. Well, anyway, while her teammates are scolding her, one kid dares her to kind of prove that maybe she has some stones that they think that she doesn't have. And they dare her to follow this woman named Miss Woodley. And Miss Woodley is thought to be related to the Fear family, who's a pretty big focal point in the Fear Street lore as a whole for the entire franchise. Yeah, this book, like other Ghost of Fear Street books, sometimes plays on classic Fear Street lore. Luckily, you don't need to know much about it here, but Miss Woodley is, let's just say, is a descendant from a certain Fear person that's a pretty big character in some of these stories here. So Jane ends up taking the offer to go follow Miss Woodley to kind of prove herself to her teammates that she can do this. And she recruits her friend Lewis and Lewis's dog to kind of accompany her to spy on this woman. And they end up in the woman's backyard. They're hiding over in the hedges, but they see that she's digging a hole, like this massive big hole. and they're kind of talking about what it could be for. I think they bring up dead bodies and treasure. It kind of adds to the fun of it all. But Miss Woodley ends up catching them in the act and ends up chasing them. And what ends up happening is the kids have to run. And through this manic chase, Lewis ends up tripping over a root and falling down this huge embankment towards a riverbank. And when Jane sees this, since Jane has Lewis's dog, she and the dog end up going down the safer route to get down to the riverbank to make sure that Lewis is all right. And it turns out he is. But while they're down there, they notice this cave system there. And if you're not familiar with Fear Street Woods in some of these Fear Street books, there's a lot of mysterious supernatural stuff out there nearby Shadyside. And Lewis seems to have some background knowledge about caves and how it's cool that they found one of these. It seems like years ago, back in the town's early history, through books that he's read, that it was really popular for cave systems to be toured by the locals. But it's also kind of tied to the stigma about the woods that plays later on in the story as well. Well, the two kids, while they're down there, they're like, well, you might as well go check it out and see what's in there. They see a log blocking the cave system, and they end up moving the log out the way. And when they do that, all these bats start flying out of the cave. And one bat in particular is like pretty much chalk white in color, and once it hits sunlight, it catches on fire and burns to death. Now, this raises the alarms of the kids, but they're like, okay, well, that was weird, and they hear some mysterious noises going on in the cave that kind of catches their attention, so they decide to investigate. I think they leave the dog behind or something nearby the entrance, and they go in by themselves. And Lewis is kind of banged up from, his injuries from falling down and all that. And the kids end up wandering into this giant cavern system. And they find themselves nearby this water, and they hear moving water and all that. And they see these weird colored animals in there. Like they see this all white fish that seems to hide in like the crevices of the water. And then they see these like worm looking creatures as they get deeper into the water. And Lewis ends up kind of like falling into the water a bit. And, Jane has to end up helping him. And in the process of doing that, he ends up getting covered by all of these worms that have kind of attached to him like leeches all across his body. It's really gross. And Jane has to like knock him off Lewis. And once she takes off the worms from Lewis, she noticed that Lewis was kind of unfazed at the worms being on him in the first place. And he's not really acting like himself. And the two agreed to, leave the cave because things are getting a little too weird. And they end up, going back home. Well, as the days go on, Jane, when she's trying to hang out with Lewis, Lewis seems to be kind of gravitated towards doing cave exploration. Now he's picked up books from his library about caves. That's all he seems to be talking about. And I'm gonna kind of skim over this stuff because I don't want to ruin some good scenes in the book here. But essentially, Jane, for example, she's at like practice or playing a game one day, and she noticed that Lewis is not there, and she tries to find Lewis at his home, and sure enough, she thinks to find him at the cave system, and she thinks that she hears somebody in the cave system, right? So when she shouts Lewis's name, she gets an unexpected response, thinking that, oh, something supernatural might be going on with this. But Lewis is like, oh, yeah, you found me. I've been in the cave, right? And she's like, well, why do you keep coming back here? And he's like, it's just something that I think is intriguing, right? And, Jane is like, all right, whatever, let's just go see the cave a little bit more and, hoopla stuff, right? Well, as the story goes along, Lewis seems to be more immensely preoccupied with going to the cave by himself. At one point, Jane invites Lewis to do something with her to go re-spy on Miss Woodley to get more evidence on her. But I think that he does the same thing, essentially, what I just described. And that might have actually happened in the events prior, but that's not really all that important. But all you need to know is that Lewis keeps running away from Jane, essentially, at various points of the story. And it comes down to this point where Jane catches Lewis in a lie when she's looking for him, and she goes over to his house, and he's talking to his mom, and his mom's like, "Oh, well, he left the dog in his book bag here, but he said that he was going to go help you with something, blah, blah, blah." And Jane's like, "Oh, and she's telling in her monologue to the reader that, oh, she's heartbroken that Lewis is lying to her. But she's like, okay, well, I'll take the backpack and I'll take the dog, and I'm going to go meet up with him." So they end up going, her and the dog end up going to the cave, and the dog is petrified of going in because of this white cat that's in there. There's various animals that are like chalk white that don't like the sunlight in there. And the cat scares off the dog. But Jane thinks that Lewis is in there, and she knows in her gut that he's in there. So she decides to go explore herself. And once she's in there, she has this altercation with the cat, which kind of distracts her. And she ends up falling down this hole. And when she falls down the hole, she's like further underground. She ends up falling into a body of water, thinking that she's going to drown to death. But she manages to kind of save herself, and she washes along a shoreline that Lewis is calling her to. And once she gets over to the shoreline, she notices that she's covered in these worms again, like Lewis was before. So she has to like scrape them off, and Lewis doesn't seem like he cares to help her take the worms off. And Lewis is like, "Oh, thank you. You brought my book bag and all that." And she's like, "Well, the thing almost caused me to drown." But Lewis reveals that he was saved by this group of people. And that's when the story kind of 180s and goes a whole different direction, where we now get to meet this group of chalk white people wearing very old clothes. And they kind of introduce themselves. There's a couple, I think, I forget their names. I don't know why I'm forgetting their names. I think it's like Michael and Bonnie or something like that. I could be wrong. I probably am. But all you need to know is that there's this couple, and they have all these other people with them, and they are pretty much the leaders. And the couple's like, "Oh yeah, we have these genetic deformities. We just hang out in here to avoid the sunlight. We go outside at nighttime, and we're going to take you and Lewis out of the system and let y'all free at nighttime. But in the meantime, we'll feed you and all that good stuff while we're down here." And Jane is caught off guard by this when she has this conversation with this guy named Robbie, or Bobby, or something. I think his name is Bobby. And the guy's like telling her that, they need to be very cautious about who they're trusting. And this kind of reminds her of this altercation her and Lewis had with Miss Woodley that I already skimmed over, but I don't want to get into too much of that because it might spoil what's going to happen next. But essentially, there's a revelation about these chalk white people underground. And let's just say there's a nefarious plot involving the two leaders with Jane and Lewis. And essentially, there's this conspiracy to maybe make them like the chalk white people underneath. And it all involves the chalk white animals and all that, and the worms in the story, and that plays a pivotal role into their plan. And it gets kind of dark with what these characters are going to do to these kids, essentially. And Jane and Lewis find themselves in a pretty much do or die or get themselves into a situation they can never correct situation. And this provides legitimate stakes. And let's just say the characters have to utilize the help and tug at the heartstrings of some other people to get themselves out of the situation, which may or may not succeed. And then once we find out what happens near the end, we do get some setup and payoff with a certain thing involving Lewis's dog that I've already skimmed over, but you'll see that in the story. And we get to see the characters go back and try to help other victims involved in the story potentially. And we get a happy ending involved to kind of send the story off on a good note. And that's all I want to tell you about Attack of the Vampire Worms. This is a fantastic book. You should really go check it out. So yeah, Honestly, y'all, I have nothing but positives to say about this book. If not one mild gripe that I think I'm probably not going to deduct points on, if at all. But yeah, this book was fantastic. The writing style from Catherine Hapka, for this being a ghost written book, was very good. I mean, this has to be one of the more easy to read, Goosebumps like books I've read in some time. It engrossed you in the story. The characters of Jane and Lewis are super sympathetic. They have a really touching relationship. We see a whole character arc with them, where Jane feels like she's kind of losing her friend, and then she has to bring him back, and that's really touching. And we kind of see Jane, kind of mold out of her skin, where she's in the beginning she's kind of hard on herself for not doing what she needs to do, and we see that kind of played in the baseball game early on, and she kind of chokes when it matters the most. But by the end, we start to realize that the stuff that she goes through means a whole lot more than a baseball game, and this adventure that she's found herself on has really brought out some of the best characteristics within her. And honestly, I love everything that involved the characters in this story, down from those kids to the villains of the story. The chalk white people of the cave were scary as all get out, y'all. Their plans with these kids are so dark and warped. And once you realize their motives and operandi and all that, everything seems to click on. And this is one of those stories you're really going to have to suspend some disbelief for a good portion of the story, and you're kind of waiting for these reveals to come. And maybe I'm a pessimist, because most of the time when I'm reading an R.L. Stine book, when he might experiment with something this weird, you might get a half-baked explanation. But this book delivered on all that. He delivered on all pretty reasonably sound explanations to this phenomenon. And pretty much everything that was set up early on that you thought was kind of random ends up mattering some sort by the end, like the whole thing with the dog and saying the certain word, or mentioning the fact that the caves have some lore behind them, and how that played a role in the past, and that definitely plays a role in the reveals in the back half of the book. And I just think this was a very well thought out and well planned story. You can clearly tell that there were themes woven in this story as well, very similar to The Haunted School, and very similar to The Tale of the Photo Finish from Are You Afraid of the Dark. This book had some themes here, themes about being forgotten, about being discarded, about wanting to exist peacefully, or living with something that you didn't choose in life, but you have to make the best of it, right? There's themes of that in here, and it's touching when it wants to be with those things, and I think that's what really sells me on this book for a good amount of it. I mean, honestly, I think the first half was pretty standard, but nothing terrible at all. But it's really that back half that really just ties this book together in a neat bow and sends it home in a beautiful way. The atmosphere to this was really creepy. There's something about having a story set in a cavern with water creatures that terrifies me. If you don't know anything about me, I have mild claustrophobia. I have thalassophobia, which is a fear of deep water. I don't know, being stuck in a cavern system with water creatures with no lights, that sounds eerie to me. And seeing these creatures that catch on fire when they touch sunlight, that's insane. That just really got to me. And for an animal creature feature type of story, with that haunted school photo finish flair, I thought this was a great mashup of that. And honestly, for how great Haunted School is as a Goosebumps book, and I haven't even reviewed that book yet, but I know from memory how amazing that book is. This is a really good alternative to that, if not almost as good, if not as good. This was just splendid from all cylinders. Now, if I had one gripe with it, now I don't know if I'm going to deduct anything on it. I'm going to make my mind up by the end of this video. It would be this mechanism that involves the worms. Now, the worms, in case you don't know, the vampire worms on the cover here, they're not quite vampires, but they are instrumental in how they create these chalk white creatures of the cave, and that might translate to the humans. Now, as the characters explain later on, I don't want to get into too much specific territory, but I might have to mildly for this portion here. There's an aspect about the worms where if they latch onto you long enough, they can drain all your blood, right? And that may or may not have been happening to a certain character in the story, and that may or may not have been giving off some addictive components where they had this compulsion to keep going back and maybe finish off what was started, which is cool and all. But there's a second portion of it that may or may not involve eating said worms that is pretty much the smoking gun and the ultimate way to convert into some of these creatures, essentially. So it makes the first part of that, like the blood-sucking part, feel kind of forced to keep having Lewis come back to the cave system throughout the book. And that really does mildly irk me because there's really no reason for it to be there other than to make why Lewis kept coming back make sense. But even then, you know, while it could have been better explained, I can kind of see the side effects on Lewis's character, for example, and some of the other characters that they mentioned in the story. I can see that. And also, the backstory involving the two main villains, I don't know why I'm blanking on their names. I want to say it's Michael and Bonnie, but I'm probably wrong. But whatever guy, I think his name starts with an M and the woman's name starts with a B. Whatever their names are, the backstory to that is super tragic. And that also kind of plays a role into my factor of not wanting to deduct points on it, because in the backstory, it does kind of play a role in one character ending up accidentally becoming, I guess, one of the first of these white creatures of the cave. And given the context of what they shared about the worms there, it kind of makes sense of what was happening to Lewis. So for that, I'm going to be forgiving on that. I'm not going to deduct anything on this. So I think we got a 5 out of 5 stars on our hands here. Y'all, I really have nothing to complain about this book with. Other than that thing, this was fantastic. I had a ball reading this book, and it's a short and sweet one at 116 pages. It cannot get a much better glowing recommendation from me for you to go experience. Easily the best Ghost of Fear Street book I've read. I'd be shocked if I find anything that's close to this or better. And I thought Tale of the Blue Monkey I quite enjoyed. I thought that was a very good book. You know, I didn't like Why I'm Not Afraid of Ghosts all that much, but this one, definite standout for the series for me. Definite gold standard, I should say. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Attack of the Vampire Worms. Let me know down in the comment section if you've read this book before. Do you love this or do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.